and this is my photo journal. Apologies for any background noises in advance. The first story I'm going to cover is the Syrian Civil War, and the first source I examined is the New York Times. Um, in the New York Times, the title of their article was "The Campaign by Syrian Rebels to Topple Assad Was Swift," and as you could see from the picture, they were very much opposed to Assad's rule, and yeah, this sort of shows that bias, like in the picture. The Times of Israel titled their article "Rebels Declare Damascus Captured in the Stunning End to Assad Family Rule in Syria," and it shows Syrian rebels sort of celebrating, overthrowing the Assad rule. And then finally, we have BBC News, and their title was "What Just Happened in Syria and Who's in Charge." It also shows the Syrian rebels celebrating. So to compare all three stories, based on the three different news sources, they all seem to cover the story pretty similarly in the sense that they weren't really opposing it. They were more so like congratulating the rebels in a sense. The New York Times made it clear that they favored the opposing side as opposed to Bashar's side of the story because they are more so U.S. out. The Assad's side was like more so U.S. enemies rather than the rebels were more so considered their allies. The Times of Israel, they also congratulated the victory. However, they seemed skeptical about the rebels that just won, and to do so, they made sure to deploy IDF forces in the buffer zone. But overall, it was still like a more positive image. It was just more so, just like sort of speculation on their end. And then finally, we have the BBC, which mediated the story very unbiased way, because they weren't necessarily taking a side. They were just giving you the facts and sort of giving a quick rundown on the timeline of how it all unfolded. The next story I'm going to be covering is the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Al Jazeera covers the story. They title it "The U.S. Withdrawal Prompted Collapse of Afghan Army Report," and in the picture it just shows, I guess like a Afghan army sergeant or leader maybe talking to the rest of the army. Al Arabiya titled their article "U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan. Aided Iran in its apocalyptic vision for the Middle East," and the picture they just have two U.S. soldiers. And then finally, the New York Times, they talk about the U.S. war in Afghanistan, how it started and how it ended, and I believe they are Taliban members on the car, and yeah. So to give a quick comparison, the three articles, they had lots of conflicting stories. Well, they were all the same story, but like their biases were different. Al Jazeera was framing it, the story, as if the U.S. just withdrew their army and just left the Afghan army, under Taliban's rule and just to get conquered by them, pretty much giving them no chance at actually, fighting back and not leaving them with anything. The Al Arabiya is putting the blame on the U.S. for calling them, not caring about human rights and just allowing Iran to quote unquote destabilize the Middle East and advance an Iranian apocalyptic death cult led by Khamenei, which shows that they were very opposed to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And then finally, the New York Times frames the story to make it seem like the U.S. did all it can to help the Afghan government and the army. But again, the billions of dollars that they gave up still weren't enough, and this was them just sort of retreating because they were dumping too much resources. Obviously, there's sort of two sides to the story. One is that the U.S. just doesn't care and just wanted whatever benefits it the most. And then the other side of the story is that um, it was just time to go and too much resources were used. So it's not really a war worth fighting anymore. The next story we're covering is the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And Al Jazeera covers this story by pretty much showing a civilian walking through like a destroyed city. And they title it Russian-Ukraine War Military Dispatch, March 12, 2022. And the caption was "Fighting rages near Kyiv as conditions deteriorate in other major Ukrainian cities under Russian bombardment." Russia Today, they don't really give it a title, they just have it the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And the caption to this story was, or this picture, was really like bland. It was just the Russian serviceman standing next to like the vehicle. And then finally, CNN covers the story by titling it "Putin lashes out with ominous threat to Ukrainians and other countries," and they caption this picture with Russian state television broadcast an address by President Putin on February 24th, which obviously sort of shows their bias immediately. So, to give a comparison with the stories, CNN and Al Jazeera covered the stories pretty similarly, yet they were still kind of different. Al Jazeera was sort of the mediator in between the two other news outlets, sort of talking about how Russia was in the wrong for attacking Kyiv and leaving civilians in those destroyed cities, which is very neutral thing to say in my opinion. CNN said that this attack on Ukraine would eventually lead to the security risk of neighboring countries, making it a massive issue if Russia wins the war in Ukraine. So while Al Jazeera sort of put Russia as the bad guy, CNN framed them as like a villain and like a massive threat. And then finally, we have Russia Today, which obviously, because it's a government controlled news source by Russia themselves, they're not gonna admit it was their fault. So they had a completely opposite take, and they said that they just sent their troops to Kyiv due to Ukraine refusing to implement the Minsk agreement and nothing else. So pretty much they were saying that they just deployed their troops there and they weren't necessarily fighting. And there's more so shifting the blame on Ukraine for being the ones to break the Minsk agreements, and none of like the fighting on their end. The final story we're gonna cover is Trump winning the election. Russia Today titled their post "Trump wins U.S. presidential election," and the caption was "The Republican candidate has crossed the threshold of 270 electoral votes, media projections show." So to me, it seemed like a very non-biased story. When looking at the picture, CBS News titled their article "Donald Trump wins the election in historic comeback after 2020 loss," and then "Indictments and Bruising Campaign." So pretty much right off the bat, you could see that they're sort of more anti-Trump than they are pro. And then finally, we have Al Arabiya, and they title it "U.S. Elections: What a Trump Win Could Mean for the Middle East and Regional Conflicts." Right off the picture, they seem very opposed to Trump winning just because they have a picture of him being the winner, and then obviously the background city is just, or whatever, I assume it's the Middle East because they're talking about it, just getting absolutely destroyed. So right off the bat, you could see their biases. The comparisons, Russia Today just seem to give their facts to the story and don't really have a side with anyone. Although it does talk about Putin refusing to congratulate Trump because the U.S. is obviously an enemy to the U.S., they're still recognizing the fact that he won and not really talking about whether it's a good or bad thing. CBS News brings about Trump's win, but they also talk about his previous issues and sort of flaws, so sort of shedding a bad light onto his victory, such as his previous indictments, his felony charges, and overall, what most people view as his bad presidential decisions. And then Al Arabiya see Trump's election win as an absolute disaster to the Middle East. Obviously, because they're a Middle East like news source, they have to focus on that area, and they see it that he'll bring the U.S. into into the conflict even more than they're already sort of doing in the Middle East. But rather than making it more peace oriented conflicts, he believes that they're just gonna cause even more havoc and war than peace in the area. Finally, the last story I would cover is Israel-Palestine. And there was a lot here, but I mainly covered one of the most recent stories, which was it was the Human Rights Watch accusing Israel of genocide for deliberately restricting water in Gaza. So CNN covered the story, pretty much talking about how they are sort of siding with the Human Rights Watch because they do see it more so as an act of genocide for cutting the water sources. And in the picture they have like a little girl just carrying water jugs around. The Times of Israel, they title their article, Rights Group Claims Gaza Water Scarcity is an Act of Genocide and Israel's Blood Libel. However, in the picture, or what I'm gonna mention later on in the article, they show that they are actually providing the Gaza civilians with water, and that pretty much sort of claiming the accusations are false. And then Al Jazeera, they also have this similar take to CNN in that they are acting an act of genocide by cutting off the water, sort of deliberately cutting off the water. And in the picture they just have women carrying around water jugs in what seems to be like very bad living conditions. So to compare the three stories, obviously CNN and Al Jazeera both have similar opinions on what's happening in Gaza in terms of cutting off the water and it being seen as an act of genocide rather than just an accident or stuff like that. And they both think that Israel is deliberately cutting it off to civilians. However, in the Times of Israel article, they argue otherwise, and they say that they aren't intentionally cutting off water access, and they are constantly taking steps to try and ensure that water is distributed to Gaza civilians. As you saw in the picture, they said that they are actively trying to escort water to them, and they deny the accusations of genocide being put on them, as they believe that they are doing the right thing in giving water to the Gaza civilians, and they're not like intentionally cutting it off. Right. Thank you, and that's the end of my presentation.